Hi, you know me. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew, Colonel Holachek, coming to you from a town somewhere in northeastern California. And today I'm going to do something a little bit different for the episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson. And I want to talk about it's called the show is going to be called Abbeville Asks. This will be the second episode. It's so titled because I do a lot of writing for Abbeville Institute, and oftentimes I get emails um, asking questions about certain aspects of Jefferson thinking, or just for clarification on something I have written or said. This one is titled Thomas Jefferson's Advocacy of the Right to Secession and His Large Distaste of Secession. And it's generated by a comment from Doug Wilkerson, an Abbevillian, who asked me recently about Jefferson and secession. He wanted to know, where does Jefferson speak plainly about secession? And so I combed the writings and found that there are a large number of places where he alludes to it or it's implicit in his writings, one of which is his Declaration of Independence, for example, where there's obvious implication there. The right to secession, right? When governments are degenerate and abusive of the rights of individuals, that rebellion is almost a necessity, and rebellion can at some point take the form of secession, some part of a nation or something, seceding against the nation itself. Now, Jefferson was always committed to the rights of revolution and secession. As I said, you get that his Declaration of Independence, and you also get his contribution and his commitment to bottom-up government generally by many, many wards at the federal level. You get the federal government. For Jefferson, supposed to be small and not very powerful, demassified. Then you get the state governments, right? And the federal government was supposed to be stay out, and Jefferson was committed to this throughout his life, that state sovereignty of the state governments over the federal government. Federal government stays out of the state government's issues, and then the state comprises counties, and presumably the state for Jefferson should stay out of the county's affairs. And the counties comprise numerous wards. He thought parcels of land, some 60 by 60 or 100 by 100 miles, and these would all be self-sufficient political units with its own school, policing unit, and things like that. Right. So we get in 1816, Jefferson writes, as I've said before, 3 singular letters, right, on republicanism, and he wants to get at the gist of what Republican government is. On July 12th, he writes to Samuel Kercheval. Governments are Republican only in proportion as they embody the will of the people and execute it. Now, this is a very loud claim. There's the embodiment of the will of the people and the execution of it. So there's a twofold function of government. They need to be cognizant that what they're doing is the will of the people, and then they need to do the will of the people. If you remove either of those two conditions, you've got a government that is no longer Republican. You've got a government that is corrupt, and that allows for the possibility of secession, right? So we can talk of this claim as being government by the vox populi government, the voice in Latin, voice of the people, right? When the voice of the people is actions are not performed consistent with the voice of the people, or the voice of the people are not being heard, then people have a right to secede and rebel against the government. Now, even though Jefferson was always in advocacy of secession, he dreaded, as the title of my talk suggests, he dreaded secession. Now, that might seem rather strange. An illustration to Elbridge Gerry on 13 May 1797, Jefferson says, I would rather even join my brethren in European wars if that alone can save us from disunion among ourselves. Jefferson is vice president at the time. Now, why is he so concerned about disunion, the breakup of the Confederation of States here? This is almost a contradiction for Jefferson, right? Because if he is a states' rights person, and states, if they feel their voice is not being heard, have a right to secede from the Union. Jefferson is always, consistent with that, believed in that. Why does he get so annoyed about the possibility of disunion? As I said, Jeffersonian republicanism always sought itself as a retreat from the amaranthine, the continual, unrelenting broils of European nations. So France and England continuing the war with each other time after time after time, and so forth. Jefferson, as I said before, always championed small federal government, demassified government, which implied, in some sense, a loose linkage of the states, that the powers of the federal government would have little control over the states other than guaranteeing them their rights, championing their rights, and conducting foreign affairs. So why should secession have been such a botheration? What if one state, for example, wants to secede from the Union? Why does Jefferson, he was mightily bothered by that? And that should be a botheration for us. Why did the nation of states have to, and during his life, of course, more states were added? Why was such a botheration that there should be any breakup whatsoever of that union? That because he was consistently bothered by that as vice president, as president, and during his retirement. We saw possibility of secession during the Alien and Sedition Acts during Jefferson's vice presidency, the Adams presidency. John Taylor, for example, campaigned for secession and argued, no, we need to stay the course. We need not to go that route. That would have been a perfect time for Jefferson to advocate secession. Also, during Jefferson's presidency, the second term, we saw Josiah Quincy. During the embargo on England, he considered rather strongly secession, urging he was a Massachusetts congressman, urging the New England states with certain problems there with to secede from the Union, the Embargo Act that Jefferson imposed. Very unpopular in the northern states, whose livelihood was based on shipping industry. So Jefferson really, in many instances, when he speaks of the possibility of secession, even though he's in advocacy of it all his life, he gets unsettled. I would even add panicked about this whole notion. He writes of disunion, as I say, as a moral abomination that trumps all other conceivable moral abomination. Now, one answer for why it's such a botheration for him is simply that the members of the Congress representing the original colonies went through hell in many respects to fight for independence of the American, what will become the American nation, American independence, and eventually American nationhood. Now, Colin Bonwick writes in his work, Jefferson as a Nationalist, tells us that there was no natural unity among the 13 colonies. Each was politically and legally distinct from its neighbors, and each possessed its own social and commercial characteristics, and thus had divergent interests, right? It follows from that one of the chief functions of the federal government was to discourage centrifugal tendencies among states, promote convergent interests. We don't want them breaking apart. We want them to come together. And he thought that, for Jefferson, this was a function of the federal government to bring us together. I should add, not artificially or not dangerously, as Hamilton was advocating, by having a Bank of the U.S., by having a large federal debt that could bring all the nations together. So, he's not, I hope Bonwick's not suggesting that. I don't think he is. So we want the federal government's job is to affect a sort of unity of the states, not in a harmful way, right? And now for Jefferson, the federal government, which was always seen to be thin in terms of its members, didn't want too many people working for federal government, thin in terms of its mechanisms and thin in terms of its costs. If you don't have a lot of mechanisms, you're not going to have a lot of costs, right? It's important to note that an American union, the federal government after the Revolutionary War, was not a necessity. It was not an imperative. It was an option, right? Um, Jefferson thought the best way to unite the American people, right, and to discourage those centrifugal tendencies of which Bonwick discusses, is to articulate cleanly a Bill of Rights, right, and add it to the Constitution, right? Madison and other people, Madison would say, well, it's not so important simply because it's so obvious. You don't need to write down the obvious. And Jefferson would counter, yes, you do, because people will have rather willowy, watery interpretations of certain things, of constitutional principles, for example. And we saw Adams was an advocate of interpreting the Constitution rather in a protean manner, let's put it that way. Jefferson championed always that human rights needed to be solidified and written down and added to the Constitution. Thus, we have our Bill of Rights today. He was correct, I think. Now, there's still more to the story. So why is he so panicked about secession? One of the problems is he defines, in many cases, I have a Jefferson encyclopedia, which is several thousand pages long, comprising political aspects of his thinking, moral, religious aspects, educational aspects. And the last part is the fourth book is sort of a potpourri of things not covered under these other terms that are sort of politically and philosophically relevant. Jefferson is fond of referring to republicanism as an experiment, and sometimes he uses the term great experiment, right? As I said, I've spotted over 20 instances of his use of that term in the political sense of which I'm going to articulate here. Here's an earlier instance. In 1791, he is Secretary of State. And Jefferson says, though the experiment, and by that he means the experiment of Republican government, has not yet had a long enough to show us from which quarter encroachments are most to be feared. It is easy to foresee from the nature of things that the encroachments of the state governments will tend to an excessive liberty, which will correct itself, while those of the general government will tend to monarchy. I would rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending to too much liberty than those attending to too small a degree of it. In other words, this is another instance of him championing states' rights, that even though each state will work towards maximizing its own liberty and we use the term taking liberties, right? He says that's not so bad thing if we understand that the excess of the federal government, the abuses at the level of federal government will be towards monarchy. And by that, Jefferson just means a strong executive or a strong oligarchy body, a small group of people abusing the privileges of the many. To James Madison on December 24. The other one was on December 23, so this sort of Christmassy feel to these things. He writes, this is 1824, we owe every other sacrifice to ourselves, to our federal brethren, and to the world at large to pursue with temper and perseverance the great experiment that shall prove that man is capable of living in society, governing itself by laws self-imposed, participial phrase beautifully placed by Thomas, and securing to its members the enjoyment of life, liberty, property, and peace. And further to show that even when the government of its choice shall show a tendency to degeneracy, we are not at once to despair, but that the will and its watchfulness of its sounder parts will reform its aberrations, recall it to original and legitimate principles, and restrain it within the rightful limits of self-government. And these are the objects of this declaration and protest. Right? So Jefferson is talking about here republicanism as a great experiment, and he's noting at the end of his life, toward the end of his life, that yeah, there are problems, that people will take liberties with their freedoms and so forth, but that and it might degenerate, but he has faith in the people themselves to correct the problems themselves. Now, the use of the word experiment shows us that Jefferson clearly just did not know that his version of republicanism, government vox populi, by the voice of the people, government through representatives that are elected by the people, didn't know that this would work, right? But he did know that the other forms of government prior to the notion of the sort of republicanism he was hoping that our country would adopt did not work, right? They didn't do anything to advance the well-being of the citizenry. Now, he also noted, he says this in his second inaugural address and several other places, and this is a common Pache Montesquieu. Montesquieu is always talking about how democracies cannot be very, very large because they tend towards anarchy. So if you have a large democracy, it's a sort of contradiction of terms. Jefferson stated otherwise, that with representative democracy, representative government, size is, roughly speaking, positively correlated with strength. The larger the government, the more stable and the stronger it'll be. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. I don't think he means you can just go, you take the correlation to go on and on and on. I mean, the larger and larger and larger it gets, the more stable, because something too large is unmanageable, geographically and otherwise, especially at the time. But what he's trying to say, his main point is, and he says in the second inaugural address, he says, the larger our association, the less will it be shaken by local passions. This is not an argument that he alone expresses. Other people have said it as well. But he talks about this in his second inaugural address. How do we not get shaken or bothered by these local passions? Jefferson's answer is, again, bottom-up governing, right? We have at the very base of the pyramid, we have ward governments, and then ward governments give birth and give rise to county governments, which give rise to state governments, and the state government gives us a federal government. But the foundation for the whole polity, as it were, is these ward governments at the bottom. That's what it means for government to be owned by the people, right? Now, Jefferson's loathing, in some sense, for secession can be explained by the notion that Republican government is an experiment, right? He hated secession for a very simple reason, because he wanted to live long enough. He says during his second inaugural address, the experiment has worked, but he retracts that later on. But the point is that how do we know it's going to work? Well, we have to, like any scientific hypothesis, we observe things over time and see if it does work. See if the government that we actually have is Jeffersonian Republican, and if so, is it working? We need to observe this and test it over time to see whether the hypothesis is confirmed or whether it's disconfirmed. So Jefferson expressed on numerous occasions his love of science was greater than that of his love of politics. He would have much rather been a scientist all of his life than a politician. Why did he become a scientist? The exigencies, the urgency of the time pushed him into politics, where he could make a big difference. And he did make an extraordinary difference in the American Revolution thereafter, right? So he said in the letter to Washington, Washington asked him to be a Secretary of State, we don't always choose our calling. Sometimes we are called to work in a particular way. And if so, if it's important, we do what we're enjoined to do. So in closing, I note that Jefferson was really panicked about secession, because if it really is true that the larger the government, so long as it's a Jeffersonian Republican government, then the more stable it will be, secession posed a a threat to that, to testing that hypothesis. If the Union itself is breaking apart at intervals or even at one particular time, how do we know that Republican government, as he says, is so stable? And the very fact that there is secession at this time or that time might be itself disconfirmatory evidence of that. So, Mr. Wilkinson, I hope I've answered your question. And the answer is that Jefferson at times refers to secession. He certainly alludes to it, and it's implicit in his declaration and many other writings. Anyone championing states' rights and individual rights at the expense of the federal government, at a small federal government, is certainly going to be at the same time in support of secession, in support of the possibility of revolution when government at some level, whether it's the state level or the federal level, becomes abuses of the rights of the individuals. So I hope you enjoyed this one. This was a little bit deep in some respects, but I hope I've answered the question neatly. That's why Jefferson, even though he consistently was a champion of secession, he dreaded secession. Ta for now. Let's do this again next week.